Hello everybody. Welcome to story time again from the Milledgeville Public Library of Illinois. The story we have for you today was made up by a man who came from Denmark. His name was Hans Christian Andersen. And this is his story about the emperor's new clothes. Once long ago, there was an emperor. This emperor didn't much care for anything except clothes. He had a new suit 3 or maybe 4 times a week. Always the best fabric, always the nicest cuts. Everything had to be rich and perfect for the emperor. He didn't care about ruling, he didn't care about dancing, he didn't care about feasting, he didn't care about fighting. All he cared about were new clothes. And so, of course, there were many people that would come and would gather in the city, and they were always hoping to see the emperor in a really fancy, nice new suit of clothes. And they were really never disappointed. And of course, there were a lot of tailors and weavers and seamstresses and such that came to the capital to try to make the best set of clothing for the emperor so that he could have his new clothes 3 or 4 times a week. Well, one day, a pair of rogues arrived in the capital. These men were tricksters. They made their living by tricking people. And they got to the city, and they heard about the emperor and all of his new clothes, and they saw him a couple of times out in grand processions showing off his new clothes, because the emperor loved to make big processions, big parades, whenever he had new clothes so that everyone could see them. Well, these 2 rascals looked at each other and said, "We have an idea. I have an idea. Yeah. We'll go to the palace and we will tell them that we are weavers and that we can make the most beautiful cloth ever seen. And the emperor, he'll give us whatever we want." And so they did. They went to the palace, and they said, "Your Majesty, we can make the most beautiful cloth you have ever seen. But we will need lots of gold and silk and things like that to make it." And one of them said, "You know, Your Majesty, our cloth is special. It has a magical power to it. You see, only those who are truly worthy can see our cloth." Well, that sounded like a very special, very fine cloth indeed. Only those who were truly worthy. So if he had any ministers who weren't worthy of their jobs, then he would know, because they would not be able to see the cloth. The emperor thought this sounded like a very fine cloth indeed, and so he ordered the weavers to be set up in a room so that they could weave this wonderful cloth. He wanted clothing made out of this wonderful cloth that they could weave. And so the next day, the 2 weavers showed up at the palace with 2 very big looms, and they were brought into the room that had been made ready for them. There were a couple of beds in the room, there was a table in the room, the servants brought them food 3 times a day, even more if they asked for it. They always had plenty to drink and plenty to eat, they had good places to sleep, and the emperor was continually supplying them with golden thread and silken threads, and silken cloth, and everything they could possibly need to make the most wonderful set of clothes. Plus, he gave them bags of gold to inspire them to work a little harder. Well, the 2 rascals went in, and they acted as though they were setting up the looms and getting ready to begin weaving the thread. And the emperor, he couldn't wait for his new set of clothes. Well, after a week, the emperor sent someone to check on them. Well, actually, every day he sent someone to check on them, but that was usually a servant or an underling, and they would peep through the keyhole, and of course, the two rascals, they were keeping their eyes open, and they're listening very carefully, and so they would hear someone coming, and they would jump up, and they would go over and act like they were weaving at the loom, even though they really weren't doing anything. So after a week, the emperor decided that the cloth must be close to done. So he wanted to know what the progress was. And so he decided, instead of going himself, because that would make him look too eager, he was going to send his oldest and most trusted minister. And so he called for the minister and he said, "Minister, I want you to go and check on the progress of the cloth. Do not forget, it is the most wonderful cloth in the world. Only those who are stupid or not worthy cannot see that cloth." And in fact, the word had spread about this marvelous cloth, because of course the emperor couldn't stop telling everyone. And by this time, everyone in the town knew about the wonderful cloth that could show you if you were stupid or unworthy. And so, of course, the minister did not need the reminder, but it was the emperor reminding him. And so he said, "Of course, Your Majesty, of course I will go and check on the cloth for you." And so he went to the room, and he knocked on the door. And when the two rascals opened it, they led him inside and they said, "Do you see, Minister, how beautiful the cloth is, and the wonderful patterns of gold in it, and the wonderful array of colors?" The minister could see nothing. Nothing. And so he was, well, rather concerned. Was he unworthy of his post? Was he stupid? Oh dear. But he was not an old minister for nothing. He knew that he could not show that he could see nothing, or everyone would know that he was stupid and unworthy of his post. And so he very carefully kept his face calm, and he said, "Oh, yes, I see the beautiful golden patterns and the wonderful colors. Yes, oh, it's lovely. Oh, the emperor will love that fabric." And the men said, "Yes, well, you see, the problem is we've run out of the gold thread, and we need a few more of the silks. Do you think perhaps the emperor might send us a bit more?" "Oh, yes, I'm certain I shall let him know." And the minister left, and he told the emperor that the fabric was most marvelous. In fact, it was so marvelous, he just couldn't think of words to describe it. Oh, but the men needed more gold threads and silks and such, so the emperor sent it to them, and a little more gold to help hurry them along as well. And then, after the end of another week, with the servants peeping in the keyhole, "Yes, Your Majesty, they're working quite hard." After another week, the emperor thought the fabric must be nearly finished, and so he sent someone to ask. And the two rascals, they said, "Oh, yes, the fabric will be finished tomorrow. His Majesty should come then, and we shall do a fitting on him. We'll cut out the pieces and make sure that it all fits him." Oh, well, that was quite marvelous. And so the emperor went with his whole court to watch the fitting. And they went and they came in, and much to the surprise of every single person in the court, they could not see the fabric. And very much to the surprise of the emperor, he could not see the fabric. Was he unworthy to be emperor? He knew he wasn't stupid, but was he unworthy? But of course, being politicians, they were all very good at keeping their faces calm. And so the tricksters said, "You'll see, Your Majesty, the beautiful gold patterns and all of the beautiful colors. Yes, Your Majesty, we shall now cut the fabric from the loom." And so they made a great show of cutting the fabric off of the loom, and then taking it and cutting out the pieces and holding them up to the emperor, performing their little fitting and trying everything on him to see if it would be the right size. Yes, yes, and taking all the measurements. And yes, 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 it should be ready, Your Majesty. And then one of the youngest of the ministers had a brilliant idea. He said, Your Majesty, the grand procession is in 2 days. Do you think perhaps this new suit of clothes could be ready for that? Oh, yes, said the emperor. Yes, I do think the new suit of clothes would be perfect for the grand procession. I should like to show it off that day. Can you have it done in 2 days? And they, oh, yes, Your Majesty. Yes, yes, of course we can have the new suit ready for you in 2 days, Your Majesty. Not a problem. And so the emperor left the room, and the two rogues giggled to themselves and pretended to sew up these suits of clothing for several hours every day. Well, the emperor, he was thinking perhaps they could use a little more incentive to move just a little bit faster, and so he sent them more gold. And they took that gold and they bundled it into the sacks where they had already put all the gold thread and all the silks and all of the gold that the emperor had been sending them, because of course the emperor was feeding them, so they didn't need to spend any of it. Well, at the end of 2 days, before the grand procession was going to happen, the emperor went to their room to fetch his new suit of clothes. And so they bowed and they very kindly said, Your Majesty, would you mind removing the clothing you are currently wearing so we can put on the new suit of clothing? And of course the emperor took off everything he was wearing. And then they stepped forward, and one of the rogues held up nothing, and he said, See, Your Majesty, here are your pants. They're light as cobwebs. And they held him out, and the king pretended to step into them, and he pretended to pull them up and fasten them in place. And here, Your Majesty, here's your shirt. It is like eider down. And they put it on him, and they pretended to put all of these clothes on him when they weren't putting anything on him at all. And then all of the people were lining up in the streets by that time to see the grand procession. And someone came and said, Your Majesty, Your Majesty, the people are waiting along the grand procession route. And the emperor said, You did remind them that my clothing can only be seen by those who are very wise and very worthy. Yes, Your Majesty, yes, the heralds have just gone along the parade route proclaiming that to the world. Ah, good, good, good. All right, 2 of you, come and carry my train. And so the emperor stepped up to the beginning of the parade route wearing absolutely nothing. And 2 courtiers stepped up and pretended to pick up a train that was not there. And the emperor began to walk along the parade route. And all of the people bowed and cheered for the emperor's new clothes, even though none of them could see any clothes on him. And about halfway down the parade route, there was one little boy who was just not quite old enough to understand what very wise and very worthy meant. And so when the emperor came round the corner and this little boy saw the emperor, he called out, The emperor! The emperor has no clothes on! The emperor is naked! Well, his parents, of course, tried to shush him very quickly. But usually when children yell out something quite that funny, to them at least, it's really hard to shush them. And many of the other children started to pick up the cry as well. Well, the emperor, suddenly he realized he had been tricked. And the little boy, the children were right. He was not wearing any clothing. But he couldn't just stop the parade in the middle of the town. He had to finish the parade, because if he didn't finish the parade, then people would think he was foolish. And so he continued to march along, wearing absolutely no clothing, with 2 courtiers following behind him who continued to pretend they were carrying a train that did not exist. And after that day, the emperor was never quite so fascinated and absorbed in finding new clothing. And although the people of the town still treated him with respect and kindness as befitted their emperor, they never quite forgot that very odd parade that had happened so very long ago, and they never quite forgot the lesson. None of them ever quite forgot the lesson that being completely absorbed with the way one looks and the clothing one wears is not a good thing to do. And if you were curious about the two rascals who had woven the non-existent clothing, well, before the procession was even halfway gone, they were already on their way out of town, riding their horses as fast as they could go, with so much gold and silk and golden thread in their bags that they never had to do another bit of work for the rest of their lives. And that is the tale of the Emperor's New Clothes, invented and written down by Mr. Hans Christian Andersen. I hope you enjoyed it, and we will see you again on Monday at 3 o'clock Central Daylight Time, when there'll be another story from the Milledgeville Public Library of Illinois. I hope you have a great weekend. Bye!